religious school students cannot do that. So when they miss something, it's difficult to get back on track. So I do like with this that we can really build nicely one lesson to the next. And so last time, I'm just going to share my screen so that we can see the slides. I'm going to share it in the same way that I did the last time because I think people could see it better. There we go. Right? I think a little bit larger. So we're going to review a couple of the concepts that we talked about at the end of our last session. And they're also going to help us. Ultimately, what we are going to get to today is this concept of binyanim, this concept of verb constructions. And really, the verb constructions are going to add a lot of, it's a very powerful tool that the Hebrew language uses in order to turn a three-letter root into a number of different things, how to create all sorts of cool verbs. And we really couldn't get to it up until this point because we were building all of these elements. So one of the things that we're going to talk about, even just in reviewing the Vav, is identifying this dagesh chazak, this dot that is in letters that you might not always expect them to be in. And that's also going to play a role. Understanding that dagesh makes it really, that's an important part in understanding and recognizing certain binyanim. So, sometimes people teach the dagesh chazak in one lesson. We've probably covered it over the course of 3, and it's really because she does a lot. So it's something that we need to keep in mind. So here I'm just going to review a little bit of last week. We talked about this prefix of the vav, and for modern Hebrew speakers, they're pretty much familiar with it as what we would call the vav conjunctive. And sometimes in Hebrew classes, we say the means and, right? So what we're really saying, if we were to get technically accurate with that version of the vav, it's really this vav conjunctive, which can mean and, it can also mean but, it can mean or, and it can also be untranslatable. And I tried to show that in this slide. So right here I have a few verses from the beginning of the book of Genesis. This is when God creates light. And you'll notice that I made the vav conjunctive, which can, again, either mean and, but, or it can be untranslatable. I made that gray. So it's a little bit harder to see, but I made it gray so that we could identify them. And one of the things that you'll notice when I did the English translation is right here, I put kind of in brackets, I wanted to just mark where one of those vav conjunctives is in the Hebrew that doesn't actually have an English word that you would use to directly translate it letter by letter. So here we have, in this verse, we have Vaikra Elohim la'or yom, right? The Lord called the light day, V'lachoshech kara laila, and the darkness God called night. So you translate that and, but if you go just before it, you have this separation, Vayavdel Elohim ben ha'or uven ha'choshech. And God separated, or then God separated. Ben kind of means between, right? So separated, and even that word doesn't really get translated in the translation. So ben ha'or uven ha'choshech, between the light and between the dark. But really the way that you would translate that is you would essentially, some of these letters and words are kind of assumed. So the nice way of translating it is God separated the light from the dark, or the light from the darkness. And so that's just a way that, again, you can, depending on how you're translating it, you can say and, or you can even just leave it untranslated, but it connects the use of this vav connects this concept of lightness and darkness, and also distinguishes between them with that word bein or uvein. So that's the vav conjunctive. Again, it's a pretty commonly known concept in modern Israeli Hebrew, and people will say it means and that's just the vav conjunctive. And it can be either vi or u, and we'll talk about that, I think, on the next slide. The other one, the one that we really touched on a lot at the end of last session that I wanted to review, is what's called the vav consecutive. And the vav consecutive is often translated just as and, similar to the vav conjunctive, which is why sometimes when people are used to certain biblical translations, you start noticing this like, and God said to Moses, and this happened, and that. And it's kind of, it's showing you that the vav is there, but in these cases, the vav really doesn't mean the word and. The vav does not get translated in the same way as it does when it's a vav conjunctive. The purpose of the vav consecutive is to show the order. It's to show progressive in a progress in a narrative. So here, I'm just going to go back to the beginning of verse 3. Vayomer Elohim yihi or, and God said, instead of saying and God said, because again, the reason that we say that is because you have the vav, which people commonly translate as and. Really, you can either not translate this word at all and just say, God said, let there be light. And you know, as a Hebrew translator, you know that this is an action following a previous action, or you can help someone out and say the word then, right? So Vayomer Elohim hi or, then God said, let there be light. And what we're going to get to in a few slides is the way that this verb is constructed. This verb yehi, I bolded all of the verbs here, but this is not a perfect or an imperfect, which again, we're going to review. So that's the vav consecutive. You notice that the vav consecutive always has an ah sounding vowel under it. So you either have the patach, that horizontal line, followed by a dagesh chazak in the next letter. So here it just so happens that all of these examples have a yud. And so you have a dagesh chazak in the yud, or sometimes that a vowel can turn into a kamatz, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Okay, so I want to go over the variations, that difference between the v and the u, and we're going to start with the vav consecutive, and then we'll go to the vav conjunctive. So with the vav consecutive, this is the one that means and or. We have the standard version, which you see most often, right? V. But then sometimes it transforms into an u. And we talked over the last couple of weeks the two rules that do that. The first we call the bump rule. It's when you are following up the vav with a labial sound, the B, M, P sound, the bet, mem, pe sound. And so I gave you 3 examples of when that happens, right? So instead of v vein, it turns into u vein because you have that bet or that vet following the vav. And the next one you have u mile u, and you have that instead of v mile u because again you have that mem sound, that labial sound following the vav. So the v turns into an u, and same thing with u fetach. There are in English as well and in Hebrew, there are a lot of interesting language phenomena that occur around these labials, sometimes called bilabials, because you're using both of your lips there. And you notice, by the way, that these are usually the first sounds that babies make. These are some of the easiest sounds to make, which is why you have like mama and papa or ima or abba, right? So you have these open vowels with these labial sounds. And so a lot of, when you see certain linguistic phenomena around the labials, it's because it's kind of a very primitive, very easy, natural sound. And so you end up making other sounds kind of conform to them. These are very fundamental sounds that we hear with that bet, mem, and pe. And I just call it the bump rule so that it's easier to remember. And then the second rule, which we talked about when we were splitting words up into their syllables, is that the shava, that like the 2 dots stacked on top of each other, the shava vowel, is not a real vowel. It doesn't carry any weight. And so it cannot be in its own syllable on its own. It's either not a sound or it makes an I, like in the word bit. And so that's just not a very strong sound. It's not a true vowel. And so it cannot be in its own syllable because remember, syllables are defined by having one vowel. Because it's not a real vowel, it cannot be in its own syllable. And you cannot have 2 shavas in the same syllable. And so here, these 3, you'll notice the v, this vav I'm sorry, this heading is incorrect. This should be vav conjunctive. That's what happens when I do these late at night. And so here you have these three examples of the Vav conjunctive where it went from a V to an U, but it's not because it is preceding a bump letter. It's because it's preceding a letter that holds a shava, and you cannot have those two shavas in the same syllable together. And the first shava cannot be a standalone syllable. So instead of V nikeva, this becomes un keva. And instead of V revu, it turns into urevu. And instead of V le mikveh, this turns into ul mikveh. Okay, so that's kind of the rule with the Vav conjunctive. And now, of course, I totally, when I did these slides, got this wrong. So this now we're talking about the Vav consecutive. So the Vav consecutive also transforms. Again, the standard is that patach, that horizontal bar, that a vowel, which is a short vowel. So you have the Vav with that patach under it, followed by a dagesh chazak in the next letter. So vayar, vayikra, vayomer, those types of words, that's the Vav. That's how you recognize the Vav conjunctive. But it can change a little. So sometimes you have a Vav conjunctive. I'm so sorry. I'm looking at the heading and I'm totally making that mistake. This is the Vav consecutive. Okay, so the Vav consecutive, we have, like in the word vayehi or, this does not take a dagesh in the yud because of the shava that's under the yud. So when the next letter following the Vav consecutive has a shava, it cannot take a dagesh chazak because the dagesh chazak intensifies the sound. Because this isn't a real vowel, it cannot be intensified. And so you just get rid of the dot, right? So the dagesh chazak just disappears. And so you have these vayihi, vayechulu, vayivarech. These are all Vav consecutives that are just missing that dagesh chazak. And sometimes it transforms into a kamatz, a long vowel, a long a vowel. And that's when there's no issue of the voweling here. So I'm going to take this second word here, va'er'eh. There's no shava under that aleph, so the aleph should take a dagesh chazak, but you have these guttural letters like the aleph, the ayin, the hey, the chet, and they really usually, and also the resh as well, these cannot usually take a dagesh chazak. They're these guttural sounds. They're hard to intensify because they're in the back of the throat. And so here, instead of just dropping the dagesh chazak, the vowel under the vav turns from a short vowel into a long vowel, essentially to function as that intensifier. And then the other thing that we were talking about last week that I know is a little bit confusing is that this is when I was taught Hebrew, I was taught that the Vav consecutive is what's called the Vav hahipuch, this reversing Vav. And the reason for that is because when we talked about aspect last time, where the perfect means a completed action and the imperfect means a not yet complete action, in modern Hebrew, and this is true also biblically, that most of the time a completed action will correspond nicely to a past action because you've done it. Modern Hebrew got away from aspect and moved toward tense, so the perfect became past and the imperfect became future. And so what we find biblically here when we use the Vav consecutive is that when you are talking about past tense, when you add the Vav consecutive, you actually flip from going from an imperfect, or I'm sorry, if we're talking about the past, you switched from perfect to imperfect with the Vav. So here, I use this example, the word Omar is imperfect, right? That I will say, like future tense. And if you're talking about this as a Vav, as a step in a past process, you add the Vav consecutive, but you keep the imperfect form. So this is called the Vav consecutive imperfect. And then it transfers, it switches, right? That hefech, lahafuch, is to flip, right? So it reverses this into then he said, past tense. Same thing here with the Vav consecutive perfect. The Vav consecutive perfect is less common and it is sometimes a little bit tricky and it's harder to identify. So we're not really gonna, it's kind of like a thing that we don't have time for, but especially this vav consecutive imperfect. Usually when we're telling a story, we're telling a past tense story. And so this occurs very, very often in the Bible, where you see instead of va'amarti, right? So that T would make it the perfect, where you're talking quote unquote past tense. If you're using this vav consecutive, you want to show that you're telling stages in a story, you keep the imperfect. And even though you would think that that would mean future, it actually is past. So that can be a little bit, I call that aspect tripping. It's kind of like there's some not a drug, but like a thing that you eat that turns, it's called flavor tripping. Something that is sweet becomes sour and sour becomes sweet. So people like coat their tongue in this chemical and then eat a lemon, and apparently it tastes like lemonade. So that's why I call it aspect tripping, is that the vav consecutive does this to that verb. So this is, I'm just taking a little bit of a break. We had this question on a previous class and it had to do with Hebrew. And I just wanted to address it here because it also touches, you have a sentence or a phrase that very much uses the vav consecutive, right? We hear this all the time. Leviticus uses this a lot. Deuteronomy uses this a lot. Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. The Lord spoke, then God spoke to Moses, lemor, saying, right? And people always say, I don't really get what the deal is, right? Because sometimes you have people who just say, like the example below it, you just have Vayomer Adonai, and then it just quotes, right? So the question is, what's the deal with Vayedaber and lemor? And the truth is that this is really more of a stylistic choice of a group of biblical authors. And it's kind of just like a formula that they use. And there are exceptions to all of these rules. There's a whole book that was written basically just on this. And it's essentially trying to make the case that this is sensical. And I was unconvinced at the end of that like 300-page book that this was actually sensical. So it's kind of just a stylistic, a literary, I think it was someone who was really focused on grammar. And I think anyone who studied literature would have very, very quickly said, oh, this is like the style in which this author likes to write. So we have the root of both of these words are very similar, right? Daled bet resh, like divarim, right, are words biblically. In modern Hebrew, that kind of translated, or it's more common to hear that as Devarim are like things, but it can also mean words. And lidaber means to say. And amar also basically is the same thing, right? It means to speak. And so you do have times when, like this first common formula where the vayedaber is a verb and it seems to be indicating active speech, and then lemor is kind of like the introduction of the quotation marks, right? So you could actually even translate this without translating the word lemor at all, and it could just be like, the Lord spoke to Moses, begin quotation marks, right? But it's a word, so people like to say it, and there's like a biblical formula here that is kind of nice to the ear, and so we say, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, right? But you absolutely have examples where you don't have this verb vayedaber, you just have vayomer, like in here where we have lech lecha, right? This is the famous opening line of lech lecha when Abram, before he becomes Abraham, is told to leave his father's household, and it just says vayomer Adonai, and then it quotes, right? It could have said, if it was the Levitical author, maybe they would have said, Vayedaber Adonai el Avram lemor lech lecha, but it doesn't because someone else wrote this and it wasn't their convention. So, grammarians spend a lot of, they spill a lot of ink trying to kind of explain the difference here. And I think like if they just read a few more fun books, they might have realized that this is really just a stylistic difference. And again, you have examples of this over and over and over, where sometimes you just have vayedaber, sometimes you just have vayomer, and sometimes you have this formula of both. So
can I say something? I mean, it's just stylistically not very good to have the same verb twice in one sentence. I mean, he spoke and then he spoke. I mean, unless you're going for that repetition, you try to find another word that will work for you.
Yeah, and so there are actually a couple of things that also, you'll notice that biblical Hebrew doesn't have quotation marks. And so sometimes these authors try to do things to express the quote, right? The beginning of the quote. And so that's sometimes where you get the second verb there. We also saw that here. I'm going to try to go back a few slides and see if we can get it. So if we look at, here we go. Another way that you do quotes is you use what we're going to talk about in a second. You use the jussive. Okay, so that's when I bolded these verbs that do not have a vav consecutive. You strip away the vav consecutive and you give a jussive. You give another form of the verb in order to indicate quotation marks, right? So this is another way that we see the biblical authors trying to do this. So you have Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or Vayhi Or, right? So you strip away the vav consecutive from, instead of saying Vayomer Elohim Vayhi Or Vayhi Or, right? You have this verb that's in a slightly different form, and that lets you know that the quote are these words Yehi Or, right? So that's this. There is this style as well to indicate quotation marks. Again, a different scribal school might have written this as Vayedaber Elohim Vayomer Yehi Or Vayhi Or, right? But so you have these different ways of trying to indicate the actual quotation that is being spoken. But yes, I agree with you. There are all sorts of literary conventions that are a little bit odd. You also have people try, the use of the word et, which again cannot be translated. There isn't a word for this. Sometimes you have biblical authors who don't like to use this word, others who do. This is typically viewed as more archaic, but it's kind of hard to prove that. And so you have, same thing goes with spelling with what we call malé chaser. I think it's like, I forget what the Latin is. It's like plene. One is full and one is empty. It's when you use those vowel letters like a yud, an aleph, a vav, a hey, when you use that when you don't need to. And so like sometimes you have the name David spelled dalet, vav, daled. And sometimes you have a different biblical author will spell it dalet, vav, yud, Daled, to let you know that there's that E sound in David, right? So you have, when you have a collection of works all written by different authors, you do have some of these different conventions. And also we have to remember that there's a good chance that different scribal schools held different conventions because they had a different idea of formality. So it's possible that some of these that you would not ever hear, like Vayedaber Adonai al Moshe Lemor, you would not hear that in regular speech. It was something that was intentionally like overdone for God's speaking, right? So it's kind of an interest. I would love to go back and ask all of these people what they were doing. But you do have modern. There's a kind of a debate it's not so much a debate, it's mostly just passive aggressive notes and introductions. But biblical translators will debate whether they should translate the Bible using more modern language or more like King Jamesian old language. And they all just, if you read the introduction to any biblical translation, it's mostly just passive aggressive comments on how they are more correct than everyone else and that everyone else is destroying the Bible, right? So you'll have one translator who will say all this thee and thou and thy and repetition and all this stuff. It's no one's going to be able to access this. The Bible's going to die out because you're making it inaccessible. And then you have someone else who says, what's with all of this like non-biblical language so that people can access it? Now it's just like Harry Potter. You need a fancy thing. So even the biblical authors, I like to think, fought these fights. And I assume they did it passive aggressively as well. And we see that.
Can I interrupt? Don't forget the Emoji Bible. You've seen that one.
I have. That's lovely, actually. And there are going to be people like me who think that's a great way of accessing it. And then there's going to be someone who will say, I cannot believe it. But yes, and we do see, we talked about this, I think maybe in our first session. If you look at the like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the collection of Dead Sea Scrolls are a good example that you see different spellings and different writing conventions in those. So not only different from the Masoretic text that we have today, but also different from each other, because the Dead Sea Scrolls were essentially a library collected over a large period of time. We see similar things in the Cairo Geniza as well. So you did have, and again, I assume it wasn't actually outward debate. It was more, I'm going to rewrite this part of the Bible using my convention, you'll do yours. Whoever preserves it in better mason jars is going to win out. So I think that's kind of how that worked. And so here, right, we have these other two, we talked about perfect and imperfect. And then there are also these command verbs, which I think are also common, and they're kind of interesting just to note. The first is the imperative. I like to think of these as like a second person command. So, like do this, talking to you, like you must do this. And so that's where the word like daber comes from, and kitov, right? Speak, write. And the way that you get these commands, which kind of also makes sense when it's a command, is you take an imperfect, right? Imperfect meaning something that is not yet complete or a future tense, and you shorten it for a command. And I think that shortening serves as that exclamation mark, right? So shortening, and I do this too, right? If I am really upset with someone, or I want, I'll just, my sentences become very, very short, right? And so it kind of is a way of making the verb emphatic, is that you shorten it. So you'll see I took just what I would normally use as an imperfect construction of this verb, where you have yidaber, like future tense, he will speak, and I just get rid of the prefix and it turns into daber, speak, right? Tichtov, also he will write, and you just get rid of the prefix and it turns into ketov. So the imperative is this essentially kind of like a second person command. You don't really call it perfect imperfect, you just call it the imperative. So if you were to look in a dictionary, it would not say perfect imperfect, but it's essentially an imperfect that's been shortened to emphasize the command. And you also have these jussives, which again, I think of kind of as a third person command, like let there be light, right? I'm not saying to the light, like be, I'm saying to the world, to the universe, right? Let there be light, right? Sometimes you hear people say like, Yechi HaMelech, right? Long live the king, right? Yechi, like to be chai is to be alive, right? So Yechi HaMelech, let the king live, right? Long live the king or whatever. So Yechi. So you have here Yehi, and it's again shortened from the imperfect of Yihye. And you have like Vitzav, right? And command. So you'll hear God will say that to Moses, right? Like tzav et bnei Israel, right? Command these people. And so you have this shortened version of the imperfect, which turns into either the imperative or the jussive. And again, these are used to indicate that quote, right? That's another way of indicating the beginning of the quotation mark, is when you would expect a vav consecutive to appear, but then you see the imperative or the jussive, that word begins the quote. And then the quote usually ends at the next vav consecutive. Okay, so now we come to our binyanim. This is, something that I will say is you get a lot of like bang for your buck when it comes to understanding binyanim. But I will also say that everything that I'm about to say is there are exceptions to all of this, and it's a little bit imprecise. And so what we gain in a clear system, we lose a little bit in precision, but overall it's okay. The binyanim, these verb constructions, this is when you start to play with vowels, when you start to play with prefixes and suffixes to build from a three-letter root into something bigger. The binyanim are generally speaking the same between biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew. This is not something that has totally evolved. Typically in biblical Hebrew, they'll call it kal. So if you look at the most simple basic construction, in a lot of biblical dictionaries, we'll call it the kal, and kal just means the simple, it's basic. But you can also be called the pa'al, which in modern Hebrew is what they call it. They call it the pa'al. The word pa'al, that root of pei, ayin, lamed, means like an action or a working. And so a po'al is the Hebrew word for a verb, right? So that's why we use the word pa'al as kind of the way of naming these constructions. You'll see in a minute, though, that it's actually a terrible word to use as an example. And so I'm not going to use it so often. But that's basically what these are called. They're built off of this root of pei, ayin, lamed, which means, again, if something works, I would say ze, it, poel, it works. Poal is a verb, so these actions. So you have these 7 binyanim. Slight difference really between what was biblically the hofal. We have a kamatz katan here, the hofal, and in the modern Hebrew turned into a hufal. But again, it's that vowel of the O and the U are in the same family, so it's not that big of a shift. So moving forward, I'm really going to be using kind of the biblical Hebrew, but they really have not changed much between biblical Hebrew and modern Israeli Hebrew. So here's the question, like, what do they mean, right? So you can group these into kind of a grid. So on the left here, you have active constructions, and on the right, you have passive constructions. So they kind of have a partner. So the kal or the pa'al is active, and then it has this pair of the nif'al, which is passive, and I'll give examples of that in a moment. The PL has a partner in the pu'al, where the PL is active and the passive is and the pu'al is passive, hif'il and hof'al. And the only one that doesn't have a partner is this hitpa'el, which is reflexive because you're doing it to yourself. You're kind of active and passive at the same time. And so if you're doing something to yourself, it's going to be considered active. And so then you can, on the other axis, you can group these by basic, intensive, causative, reflexive. So kal and nif'al are both basic. The PL and the pu'al are intensive. The hifil and the hof'al are causative. The truth is, this also is a little bit inaccurate. Some people, instead of calling it intensive, will call it transitive. There's all sorts of exceptions to this, but it's a clean way of getting a general idea. There is a little bit of debate in the Hebrew world of how useful this actually is if you teach it as a formula, but generally it gives you a good idea. So if you know the meaning of a root, and then you can identify what binyan it is in, and you can identify things that we covered last week, like the person, the number, the gender, you can really get a pretty accurate translation of a verb based on identifying what vowels are in what place. And we'll talk about tips and tricks to identifying them. The next slide is an image that I took off of the internet. I did not make it, but people like to put this into a menorah. And so this is the menorah. They kind of have it flipped where we have the pa'al or the kal at the bottom here. So the bottom half is active, the top half is passive. And then you have kind of, if you follow the branch, you get the connection of simple. So the nifal and the pal are both simple. The PL and the pu'al are both intensive, and the hif'il and again, this is a modern Hebrew graphic, so it'll be the hufal instead of the biblical hofal. That's causative. And then you have the standalone reflexive or cooperative here in the middle there. So just another way of visualizing it. You will see a lot of, and if you actually Google just the words binyanim menorah, you'll see a lot of people try to make this in a cool way. And so instead of me just adding another graphic on top of all of the other graphics, if you Google, I think if you go to the Wikipedia page for like Hebrew verb constructions, they probably will also show something similar to this. So it's kind of a clear way of doing it. For my use, I usually like to view it like this. It's just a little bit cleaner to me, but a lot of people like the visual. And, when you have something that's in groups of 7 like this, Jewishly, you have the menorah at your disposal as a nice way of visualizing it. And so now I'm going to use a different root to show the difference between each of these verb constructions, I want to use the root kuf tet lamed. One of the reasons why I move away from pa'al is because that ayin is a guttural, and that guttural cannot take a dagesh chazak. And so one of the things that is a key in identifying, especially the intensive and the reflexive constructions, is the presence of a dagesh chazak. And so when you make the quintessential root that you're describing these constructions after, when the middle letter is a guttural that cannot take a dagesh chazak, it's a really not so useful word to use. So here we're going to use a very commonly used one in Hebrew textbook, katal. And so here in the kal, the basic active, katal, he killed, right? Very, very simple, very basic active. Its partner is the nif'al, and it's niktal, okay? So the nif'al is niktal. You'll notice that the names nifal, pual, pial, they're all using the same verbs that you would, they're using the same vowels that you would get if you actually used that construction. So the basic of kal, active, he killed, goes into niktal for the passive, he was killed, or killing was done to him. You get the intensive, pl, kitel, is he slaughtered. It's a more intensive word of killing, right? It's a more intensive act of killing. And, you could also maybe translate that as murdered, right? So however you want it, but the key there is that it's intensified using the PL. You will see not only the EA vowels like in PL, but you also see the dagesh chazak in that tet. That is a really good giveaway that you're going intensive here. In the pu'al, you have kutal, he was slaughtered or he was murdered, right? You have the causative, he feel, he, and when you use he feel, so it turns, katal turns into hiktil, he caused it to die. Hoktal is the hofal, he was caused to die. And then you have the hitpa'el, hitkatel, he killed himself, right? If you notice, we talk about this Jewishly all the time. People love using this as an example. The word to pray is in the hitpa'el, right? Lehitpalel is to pray. So tefillah is the noun, lehitpalel, to pray. And sometimes you will hear, oh, it's reflective. So it's like interceding with oneself, right? I actually think a lot of these nuances that we've touched on are kind of just there to give rabbis a job of like interpreting things in 1,000 different ways. And so, hitpalel is in the reflexive. That's more of a linguistic choice than a theological choice, but it makes for a good sermon, so we use it. So the hitpa'el is that reflexive, and it does not have a partner. And so hitkatel, you would say, I'll use a more common modern Hebrew word would be lavash, he wore, hitlabesh, he dressed himself. Okay, so you can use that hitpa'el. It's a very, very commonly used one for words where you do same thing. If you feed yourself, there are all sorts of verbs that you would use a reflexive in a really meaningful way. And so, and if I was teaching a modern Hebrew class, sometimes I would teach like with the word lavash, because people know lehit labesh is to get dressed, is to dress yourself. Okay, so again, another one common root that we like to play with is katav. And I'm using this for a couple of reasons as well, which I'll make clear. So katav, he wrote, nichtav, it was written, right? So we're still in the basic, active and passive. When we go into the intensive, we have kitev. Ooh, I missed the dagesh. There should be a dagesh in the tav there. Kutav, it was inscribed. Kitev, he inscribed it. One of the things that I wanted to use this as an example of, and I guess on the small screen, I forgot to add it, is one of the things that is tricky about the dagesh chazak is it's hard sometimes to identify when it is in a letter that could hold a dagesh kal, right? So the tav having a dagesh in it often does not seem odd, right? That doesn't seem like it shouldn't be there. And so it takes a little bit of skill to identify that that is a dagesh chazak in the tav and not a basic dagesh kal that's telling you nothing, right? The reason that katav, wow, had I made this slide the way that I wanted to in my head, this would be a much more powerful example. The word katav, right at the top, right, in kal, there is and should not be, right? There is not a dagesh in the tav because it's following an open syllable, right? So the first syllable of ka ends with a vowel. It is open. The tav in the next syllable will not take a dagesh kal because it's following an open syllable. The same should be true in kitev, but if I had made the slide correctly, it would have a dagesh in there. And that's a giveaway that the dagesh is a dagesh chazak, is because the ki syllable is also an open syllable. And so the tav shouldn't have a dagesh in it. If I had done this correctly, there would be a dagesh chazak in there. And so, kutav is a good example here, where the ku syllable is open. The tav should not have a dagesh in it, but because it is an intensive construction of pu'al, it does get a dagesh. So these are kind of like the little subtle things that are a little bit hard to pick up on, but they're useful to note.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm awake today. Let me see. How is this taught in Israel? Is this, suppose we're in second grade. Their children are not taught with vowels. When I wandered around Jerusalem, it took me a week before I could read anything. And I can only, of course, read the words I already knew. But the vowels are not there. So is this just for Torah study? Is this taught to first grade, and by second grade, third grade, the kids don't need it anymore? I just never thought to inquire.
Yeah, so it's typically used in like a late middle school or a high school setting, like in grammar classes. So they will teach it in, and what's funny is that my grasp of Hebrew grammar is actually much better than my grasp of English grammar, because I don't think it's that I wasn't taught it in school, but because I know English, I wasn't paying attention. And I took that for granted. Whereas for Hebrew, but when I was a kid, I did very, very poorly early on in my Hebrew classes because they were learning all of these constructions. They also had all of these different like mnemonic devices to remember all these things. And I was I'm like, it just, one sounds right and one sounds wrong, which I'm sure was not fun for my Hebrew teachers. But, so when they would say, oh, like hitlabesh, how do you know that hitlabesh means to dress yourself? And I would say, because when I tell my dad that I'm going to get dressed, I say hitlabesh. And they say, no, it's because it's reflexive. And I was like, I don't know what that means. So there definitely is, in modern Hebrew, this is something that is taught pretty early on when you get to like serious grammar classes, Hebrew grammar, in the same way that they would start teaching. This comes usually after they're teaching tenses and how to make something plural and stuff like that. But an Israeli kid is going to know this stuff, is going to be able to translate these words properly just by how it's used.
Right, because kitav and kutav, if you're writing it without any vowels, they look exactly the same.
Right. And if you were to say to a kid like, nichtav, what is that? They'd be like, oh, it's something that was written down. And you're like, well, how do you know? It's not like they're going to say, well, with nifal, you have, right? So, but yes, a lot of these, and this also makes it, something that I think is worth constantly remembering, especially when we're doing Bible study, is that it was only in the Masoretic tradition, which came 1,000 years after these texts had been written down and copied already thousands of times. It was only 1,000 years later that the vowel system was invented, right? So these types of things, and that's also part of why there are some exceptions to the rule when it comes to things like binyanim, something that's vowel heavy. The Bible will have more exceptions than something that is consonant dependent. And so it's really, you know, it was like the Masoretes kind of saw patterns more or less, and then they devised this system and they said, oh, more or less, when we see that it is, you know, an EA word, it is intensive, we're going to add a dagesh chazak, which will help you know that it's intensive because the dagesh chazak intensifies the consonant sound. And so, you know, they really got creative in creating this system. And so then when modern Israeli Hebrew was invented, and this is like in the 1800s, and I know everyone likes to give Eliezer ben Yehuda like all of the credit, and he was certainly a big part of it, but you know, they saw these and they said, okay, you know, this is useful as we come up with new words that don't have a biblical root or a meaning, that if, you know, as we come up with new words, we want a system that we can plug into. So modern Israeli Hebrew was much more of an intentional invention than ancient Hebrew was. Ancient Hebrew was a little bit more organic. Modern Hebrew was really how do we make this language work for us, and how do we lay down these rules? So actually, I would say that modern Israeli Hebrew probably has fewer exceptions to the Binyanim rule than biblical Hebrew does, because modern Hebrew was invented after the invention of vowels and this system, whereas this system was kind of retroactively devised as people read the Bible, which was being spoken and written with a lot of variety. So yeah, the kind of the history of modern Israeli Hebrew is like a whole session for another time, but it is you know, the one lesson that I here, I'm going to stop the screen share just for a second so I can see everyone. There's a question that I often get when teaching gender in Hebrew language. People say, well, what about nowadays? It's kind of upsetting that you have such a gendered language, right? What do you do in the modern world if you want to be able to speak without conveying gender? And I like to tell people there's reason to be optimistic and there's reason to be pessimistic. The reason to be optimistic, and there are people who are working on this, they're trying to evolve the Hebrew language in a new system that will be without gender. And I say, you know, the reason to be optimistic is that modern Israeli Hebrew is a modern invention. It was very intentional, and they really used the school system. I think it was in the 1920s. The Israeli school system was used. They said, forget about the adults. We are going to teach every Israeli student how to speak modern Hebrew, and we're going to teach them this new grammar system that we came up, kind of an updated vocabulary. And I think it was within only a few years, something like 90% of the students in all of Israel knew Hebrew within like 10 years. And within 50 years, pretty much the whole country was speaking modern Israeli Hebrew regularly and with some sense of comfort. And so the reason to be optimistic for people who are trying to evolve Hebrew into kind of like, let's call it third wave Hebrew, even though it's probably like seventh wave Hebrew at this point. The optimistic thing is that it has been done and it can be done, right? That the Tiberian Masoretes were very successful incorporating their vowel system, their trope marks, which we still use. The modern Israeli Hebrew was very, very successful at reviving a language that really wasn't spoken and hadn't been for thousands of years. The reason to be pessimistic, in my opinion, is that right now we have millions of people currently speaking a version of Hebrew that they are familiar and comfortable with, that is a product of really intense education and intentional growth and acceptance. And so nowadays we're not talking about the challenge that Eliezer ben Yehuda and those early Israeli Hebrew creators dealt with, which was that no one is speaking this language. So now let's create a language that no one is speaking. Now we're talking about evolving a language that is being spoken. And, you know, again, we've seen that Hebrew has changed in a lot of ways over the last few thousand years, but those changes were not 50-year changes, 100-year changes. So I do think there's reason to be optimistic. Modern Hebrew is very much an impressive invention and a revival. But yeah, people are working on updating Hebrew, and I wish them the best. But yeah, Margie?
Updating it how? Gender-wise, just taking gender out?
Yeah, so that's kind of the big one, is that it's not just about adding pronouns that, right now the first person pronouns are kind of genderless, right? So biblically you would have anochi or ani, and those are really, a woman says ani and a man says ani, right? So however you identify, you would use the same pronoun. For the second and third person, though, those are gendered pronouns. And so there is a movement to, which I think will be very successful actually, to come up with new non-gendered pronouns, because we're talking about, a pronoun system, right? You only need to come up with a certain number of words that will get adopted. Every single Hebrew verb, every single Hebrew word has inherently this aspect, this element of gender. And so getting rid of that, the word, like chalon has gender, window has gender, right? Shulchan, the desk, that word has an element of gender, a characteristic of gender linguistically. So changing that, I think you're essentially creating a new language. But people are working on doing that. The other thing that I'll say, which is another reason to be pessimistic about these changes, is that Eliezer ben Yehuda and others they established an institute for Hebrew. And one of the things that they still do to this day, which I think is kind of funny, is they're so proud of themselves for coming up with quote unquote authentic Hebrew words for modern inventions, right? And so even, the one that comes up every Passover in my family is that the word in Hebrew for a sandwich is sandwich, right? So we just took it from, you just throw an Israeli accent on it, right? The Institute of Hebrew said, wait, we have this concept of a sandwich. We have the Hillel sandwich that we do in the Passover Seder, like I think it's korach, right? So they said, oh, we're gonna call it some version of that, right? We're gonna use that as the root, and we're gonna add this to the dictionary, and all of these people aren't gonna be using a Israeli accent on the Hebrew, or on the English word sandwich. Sandwich will no longer be called sandwich, it will be called like a korach or whatever, right? I don't think a single person in the world has accepted that suggestion, and they're still doing this, right? Telephone, all of that. So it's, I think it's like a bunch of people again who are just a bunch of Hebrew nerds who are making some money, having fun, pretending like they're adding words that we don't need. But yeah, so people have been trying to update Hebrew in a lot of ways, to more and less success.
But they think they're protecting the purity of the language.
They do. Yeah. They do. I'm just being cynical.
No, there's the French Academy that doesn't want to let other words into that wonderful language and corrupt it.
Last night we watched The Professor and the Madman, which had, was more about the Oxford English Dictionary, with similar drives. Yeah.
Yeah, we have that in, I always run into people who, go back and forth on whether we need to keep using or get rid of whom. It's like, you sound pretentious, and I want to, I'm okay. So, I think that's constantly, again, I think that because language is so intrinsic, it's so entrenched in culture on a large scale, and also in identity on a small scale, they're always going to be the people, like they're always going to be fighting on this. And so I do believe in kind of the theory that in order to fully understand a culture, learning the language, not just to help bridge you with other people, but there are intrinsic qualities of language that I think are indicative of a culture as well. I think that there's some truth to that. So as people try to update it, I do wish them luck, and we'll see what sticks. So here, we'll just finish up this concept real quickly. So these are the binyanim. Just a couple of tricks to recognize them. is, so now I took out the actual letters and I tried to put boxes. Boxes in Canva were hard to formulate, so it's actually a mem sofit that I just kept hitting. But think of these not as 3 mems, but as boxes. So kal or pa'al, you have the a vowel. Nif'al is a dead giveaway because of the nun prefix. Hof'al and hif'il are also giveaways because of that hey. The PL is easy and the pu'al is easy not only because of the vowels, but because of the dagesh chazak in the second letter of the root, unless that second letter is a guttural that cannot take a dagesh chazak. And the hit pa'el, again, because you have that hit prefix and the dagesh chazak. Now, so that was for the perfect, right? Which is very common. We use it as an example. The perfect is where you get the names from. So the perfect passive basic is nif'al because, nichtav, right? But then you get into how do you do it in imperfect or in modern Hebrew, future tense. And this is also, you get a lot of these prefixes. So the kal would be like yichtov, I will write, or he will write. Or echtov would be if I used the first person. So yichtov, right? You have yikatev, right? So this is kind of, you basically are getting the yud prefix, which is the way of making it imperfect here. So this is all second person masculine, but that's how you would add the prefix. The vowels shift a little. Sometimes, again, you have examples that you have exceptions to these rules, which can make it a little bit tricky, but that's basically a way. The trickier ones, I'm just going to give you the 4 trickiest ones to identify in the imperfect here. But, kal, perfect, you always know because you have that a pairing, right? So katav, lamad, things like that. In the imperfect, it always starts with the chirik, that e sound, right? So yishmor, tishmor, that type of thing. In the nif'al for perfect, again, that nun is the giveaway for nif'al in the perfect. And when it comes to the imperfect, this is where knowing about that dagesh chazak is useful again. This, I'm just going to go back one slide so that you see it, right? The nif'al is basic. It is not intensive, right? So you would not expect a dagesh chazak to appear in a nif'al. But when you put it into the imperfect, it does. And the reason for that, so you have yikatev, there's a dagesh chazak in the letter following the yud. And the reason for that is because originally the nun was actually preserved, but that nun is that liquid letter that drops. And so it kind of evaporates and leaves the residue of the dagesh chazak in the next letter. So nichtav was yinkatev, with a nun in between the yud and the kaf, right? But yin katev, after a while, yin katev, yi katev, yi katev, you just get yi katev, and so you intensify the kaf, so you get that following the yud. For the PL, again, you have the dagesh chazak in the second letter of the root, right? So not the second letter of the word, but when you find the 3-letter root, it's in the middle letter of the 3-letter root. And again, that hif'il, you have the hey, and in the imperfect, you have like himlich turns into yamlich. The hey turns into a yud with a patach, that a sound. So that's really, those are the binyanim. We went through them quickly. The truth is, I think just understanding that menorah image is the kind of like the biggest thing, just knowing that these have pairings with the passive and the active, that you have the simple, the intensive, and the causative, and then you have this hitz pa'el, which is kind of in a category on its own. Just knowing that as a concept is probably worth everything that you would learn from the binyanim. And so, we could do examples. I'm sure Hebrew textbooks probably have like multiple chapters with all of these and their exceptions. But for us, I think that's the important thing. And so when you do hear someone give a sermon about how, to pray is reflexive, right? You have that, lehit palel, to pray is in the hit pa'el reflexive that will give some meaning to that sermon that somehow creeps up every year. Yeah. And so next week is going to be our last week, running through this class. We are going to do, what I call odds and ends. So we'll do a few more of those prefixes and suffixes. We're going to talk about, like with lehit palel, that the lamed, which will mean to, or the imperative. And so we'll talk about prefixes, we'll talk about suffixes, we'll put together a couple more examples just that you see how this all fits together. And then we're also going to talk about just why this is useful to know and what you can do with it, right? So obviously in 6 weeks, we're talking also about receptive language and not expressive language. So this is about understanding something that we're reading, understanding something that we're hearing, not trying to generate it necessarily on our own. But I think there are really good applications for whether it's finding meaning in prayer, finding meaning in biblical things. If you go to Israel and you start hearing, certain vowel combinations, that maybe that would be, if you can identify kind of the root of what they're saying, it's kind of easier to understand what ballpark you're in. And then, the last thing that we're going to touch on next week is also, if you did want to continue to dive a little deeper, these are the foundations. So if you have if you want to, we get a few questions about, I don't like the translation that I'm seeing, I want to use my own. Biblical Hebrew dictionaries that are out there, these are the terms that they use. So they're organized alphabetically by the root. So that can be really complicated for someone who doesn't know about the root system, where they're like, the word starts with a lamed, why isn't it in lamed? And it's like, well, that's a prefix, right? So recognizing those odds and ends is going to be helpful. So if you did want to, use even a tool like Safaria, if you double click on a desktop on a word, it will show you a dictionary. But what you'll notice is that it won't give you the definition of the word as it's constructed. It's going to give you the definition of the root. And then it'll kind of tell you, here's what it would mean if it was in hof al or pl, etc. And so these are really the foundations that are a launching pad to continuing. So I hope that it's helpful in reading the Hebrew and understanding the Hebrew. The task of speaking Hebrew is like a lifelong pursuit that you have to do with people in your lives. That's not really something that someone over Zoom is just gonna. I have people in my life who have been trying to learn how to speak Hebrew for 20 years, and the question that I keep asking them, they said they tried Rosetta Stone, they tried Duolingo, they tried through their JCC, and I said, other than the teacher or the voice on the app, who are you practicing this with? And they're like, well, nobody. That's why I need the app. And I'm like, well, okay. So yeah, I hope this is on some level been useful, if not interesting, or interesting, if not useful. But if you do have odds and ends questions that you want us to touch on next week, please email them to me, and I'm happy to. If there's a phrase that you hear a lot, if there's some concept that we didn't touch on, or something that you've heard recently that you're curious about, definitely please let me know and we will include it. I always make the slides on Thursday nights, like really late at night. So you really cannot, almost nothing is too last minute for me to fit it in. Yeah, Jerry?
Yeah, I have a question that's a little off from everything else. When you put up your words on the screen, they're in the printed letters. And I learned script a very long time ago, but when I go to Israel and I look at a street sign, it's very hard for me to pick the letters out. Not a street sign, a traffic sign.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? Is that like a calligraphy version of Hebrew, or?
I'd have to look. It's been a while since I've been there. And usually, because I'm snobby, I notice the inconsistent transliterations into English. So there are a lot of street signs where if you go block by block, it's like the name Rothschild, right? In Hebrew, it's always spelled like Rothschild. But if you look block by block, the English, one day I will get hired to go around Israel and make all of the English uniform. But in terms of the Hebrew, you have, you do have, some of these fonts, and I think we talked about this last week, some of these fonts are inherently easier to read than others. And so, when you have a street sign that, you've got your Hebrew, you've got your Arabic, you've got your English, you've got probably it's green with some reflective white on it. They can be a little bit difficult. A lot of signs also don't use the vowels, so that can be difficult to notice. And again, if you're most comfortable with script, I mean, that's also going, you know, the script letters are, I grew up writing in script and reading in block. And when I started teaching Hebrew about 8 or 9 years ago, it took me a really long time to write in block letters. And so, you know, and then you have better handwriting and worse. So if you read the notes that I take, it does not, you know, I found a box of old things, and I think it was like something that I had written in when I was maybe like 8 or 9 in Hebrew, and I noticed that my my handwriting has not gotten any better. So that was a little bit discouraging. But you know, there are stylistic choices here. Look, a lot of people have a hard time reading out of the Torah because of that, you know, calligraphy, that style. And, you know, where you have very, very thin lines, sometimes connecting very, very thick, you know, the chet is the example that I think of often. It's like 2 zayins next to each other, very, very thick, with a very thin kind of like a triangular line connecting the 2 of them. And a lot of people have a hard time reading those. So, you know, I'll look at some Israeli street signs and see what the deal is. But, you know, my gut reaction is to say that it is not you that is the making it difficult to read. Yeah, but it is, you know, again, and these things are, you know, we have this with Sidurim, that different Sidurim will use different fonts, and sometimes those are easier and harder to read. And, you know, I mean, I still have a hard time reading modern Hebrew books without vowels in them. And usually I can find a friend. When I was in college, I tried to take a Hebrew class thinking that it would be easy. And I found it was maybe easy, but it was difficult to get me to attend. And so I ended up leaving the class because I stopped showing. But I did have a friend, she and I had a deal, which was she had a very, very strong education in reading Hebrew, but she couldn't understand a word. And I had a really hard time reading Hebrew. Also, I was always self-conscious about it because I grew up speaking it at home. And so when I took Hebrew classes, they were like, oh, we'll put you in the highest Hebrew level, but I didn't formally learn how to read very well. And so she and I used to sit next to each other, and she would read the book out loud, and I would translate paragraph by paragraph for her. So together we read the book. So, you know, I still have things that I struggle to read. So I wouldn't, yeah, but I'll look and see what the street signs look like these days. And yeah, but it's, you know, a lot of people, I will say, a lot of people are pushing away from teaching Hebrew script in schools because a lot of our students just aren't using it enough to write it themselves. A lot of people like, oh, I took a Hebrew typing class. That did not work well for me. I still type in Hebrew like this, which is why it takes so long to make the slides. And so, you know, I think it's always a question of, you know, an Israeli can do all of the things, right? An Israeli can type in Hebrew. Their keyboards don't even need like the stickers that I used to have to put on my keyboard. Their keyboards just come with Hebrew on them. And, you know, they're typically writing in cursive and reading in block. And so it's very easy to switch across. We have students who, I mean, this is a hard thing when we teach Hebrew to students and we try to hire Israeli teachers. They're very uncomfortable writing in block letters because we just don't write in block letters. And so it's always a question of, you know, we'll have a kid who is a very good Hebrew reader, and then they'll look at script and will be totally lost. And so, yeah, it's definitely a struggle to get comfortable with all of these things. And when I look at even the graphic design work that I do here in English, I mean, we're always playing around with fonts. And, you know, that's a piece of feedback that we're trying to improve on for the Kesher is we'll switch fonts and, you know, the designer loves the way that it looks, and then people say it's not readable. And so, you know, those are the same issues that you have in Israel, reading books and reading street signs and everything. I know that we have here, and we probably just take it for granted.
Yeah, one of my proudest moments was I picked up a bottle of water and I saw Mayim on it. I said, I know what that means.
Oh, if I can make fun of myself for a second, I remember staring at the side of a truck with a massive brand name on it. And I could not figure out what this word was. I was reading it. I'm like, sapering, sapering. I don't understand what this word is. I'm trying to find the sapering. And then someone goes, oh, it's the Spring truck. There's a water company just called like Spring. And so they just they wrote it out in English. And I was like, stress, sapering, what is sapering? I don't understand that. Spring. Oh, okay. So yeah, it's, I'm always humbled constantly whenever I go to Israel. And, I always joke that it takes me 4 hours to pick up speed. But I never get there because I'm immediately discouraged by the cab driver right when I land. So, it's like I get in the cab, I embarrass myself, and then I don't speak Hebrew for the rest of the trip. So I always say now my parents live there. So now they pick me up from the airport. And so now I've got a real good 4-hour rule. But yeah, there's nothing more discouraging than getting off the plane and just needing some time to get your bearings. And you have some cab driver who's insisting that you should never speak Hebrew again.
Yeah, I was asked in the cab one time, do you speak Hebrew? I said, no. He says, why?
That's what I have a friend who someone in Israel asked him he was asking, do you keep kosher? But the way that he said it, it kind of translates more as like, do you eat kosher? And he said, that too.
So, Yoni, why would the cab driver tell you never to speak Hebrew?
Because they're having a bad day.
That
and
is
here's
really nasty.
Oh yeah, no, I tell him I usually promise not to speak Hebrew if he promises not to talk politics. So especially the last, I guess it's always a problem, but especially the last 12 years,
yeah.
But really the last 12 years were rough, just with people's perceptions and things like that. So that was always, I would say, I won't speak Hebrew. Don't speak politics. And then we usually just sit there in silence and I'm like making sure that the door doesn't lock somehow and I can get out if I need to. But no, it's, but yeah, I mean, that's, one of the things that I think, we're trying to do. And this is something that we struggle with always with Hebrew is, for some people like me, Hebrew is the language that my dad speaks, that my mom speaks. It's welcoming to me. It sounds very Jewish. I feel like I'm in a welcoming space. And then for a lot of people, Hebrew is that thing that you had a Hebrew teacher who called you an idiot, or a cab driver who, switched to broken English and insisted on, that. And so it can be a little bit jarring. And so, the hope, at least with this class and a few of our other things. I know Rabbi Jordy is going to at some point. We're starting our adult B'nai Mitzvah class at some point, and and I forget if that's Rabbi Rick doing that or if it's going to be Rabbi Susan or Rabbi Jordy. But and Rabbi Jordy has also been talking about teaching a more conversational type Hebrew, and so I think that we've recognized at the temple that 99% of the people who will walk in our doors will not have a lot of comfort with Hebrew, but we use it a lot, and we use it in ways that for some people makes them feel, oh, I'm in a space that is uniquely Jewish and I feel comfortable, even if I don't know what the words mean. And for some people, though, it can be a little bit off-putting, and especially with the way that language and politics work together. I know for a lot of younger Jews, there's actually a turn to Yiddish now, because for a lot of, like young, hip, liberal Jews, Hebrew is the language of a state that they don't feel represented in. And so it's always interesting. When I was a kid, we were very much ideologically in line with Hebrew as like the new Jew, the Zionist Jew, the strong who fights, who, all that kind of stuff. And we looked negatively, at least in my house, on Yiddish as a language. It was kind of like the language of the old country where they didn't whatever. And then, but in my grandparents' house, Yiddish was the language of community and warmth and not being so cold and, rude. And so it's, language and politics are very closely intertwined, and it can be difficult for Jewish spaces to figure out what to do with it. So I think for me, at least, it's like, let's just show that, you know, it's not such a scary thing, that there has always been variation in it, that there are exceptions to every rule. And I hope that at least, you know, I want to take the teeth out of Hebrew at the very least.
Thank you. Yoni.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And enjoy, have a wonderful Shabbat. And we have a concert on Saturday night, and also a concert on Sunday morning. And then we go right into the frenzy that is Purim and Hamantashen baking. If you do bake Hamantashen and want to share photos of that, we're going to have Rabbi Kalman is running like a virtual bake-off where we're going to do a photo contest on Facebook. So if you do bake Hamantashen, I encourage you to email her your photos. And then we're going to have a comedy show and bingo and all sorts of stuff. So, you know, it's going to be a busy couple of weeks. So if you can enjoy some rest this weekend on Shabbat, I know that's kind of, from a staff perspective, that's our goal, is can we be restful this Shabbat, because next week is going to be Purim, Purim, Purim.
Well, thank you for all you do.
Thank you.
Yes.
Shabbat Shalom.
You're greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Jerry.